The air above Blackthorn Plantation still carries the scent of bitter almonds. Not from the orchards that once lined the property, those were cut down long ago, but from something far older, far darker. In the summer of 1868, just 3 years after the Civil War ended, 47 souls vanished from this stretch of Georgia soil. Not in battle, not from the fever, but from a single pot of stew served beneath a blood-red moon. The official ledger lists their cause of death as acute gastric distress. But the truth, whispered in hushed tones by freedmen who fled the county that night, was far more deliberate. One woman orchestrated it all. Her name was Eliza Vale. Born into bondage on that very land, she had spent 23 years watching, waiting, learning the rhythms of every man, woman, and child who walked its rows. She knew which overseer drank his coffee black, which mistress favored honey in her tea, and which child would sneak into the kitchen for a biscuit before dawn. And when the time came, she used that knowledge like a blade. But the master? She saved him for last, not out of mercy, out of vengeance. Before we descend into the chilling chronicle of Eliza Vale and the night Blackthorn Plantation fell silent, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more haunting tales from America's shadowed past, and to delve deeper into this significant event in American history. In the red clay hills of central Georgia, where the pines whisper secrets to the wind and the Chattahoochee cuts a slow, dark path through the land, there once stood a plantation known as Blackthorn. It was not grand like those of Savannah or Charleston, with their white columns and manicured gardens. No, Blackthorn was a place of sweat, silence, and iron. Its fields stretched for miles under a sun that showed no mercy, and its big house sat atop a rise like a watchful sentinel. Its windows shuddered against both storm and scrutiny. The year was 1868. The war had ended. Slavery in name was dead. But on Blackthorn Plantation, the old ways clung like kudzu to a rotting fence, tenacious, suffocating, and impossible to uproot. The master, Elias Whitmore, still ruled with a Bible in one hand and a whip in the other, though he now called his laborers employees and paid them in scrip that could only be spent at his store. He was a man of contradictions, a devout Methodist who quoted scripture at supper, yet ordered beatings for those who missed their quota. A widower who claimed to mourn his wife deeply, yet took young women into his bed as casually as one might change a shirt. And among his household staff stood Eliza Vale, a woman whose silence spoke louder than any sermon, whose eyes held storms no man dared name. She had been born on Blackthorn soil in 1832, the daughter of a field hand named Ruth and a white overseer whose name no one ever spoke. From the age of 6, she worked in the kitchen, scrubbing pots, plucking chickens, and learning the language of herbs and heat. By 16, she was cooking for the master's table. By 25, she ran the entire kitchen with a discipline that bordered on the sacred. The other servants respected her not out of fear, but because Eliza never raised her voice, never gossiped, never flinched when the master's temper flared. She moved through the house like a shadow with purpose, her hands always busy, her face unreadable. But those who knew her best, her mother before she died, the old midwife who taught her about roots and poisons, saw the fire beneath the calm. They knew Eliza remembered every slight, every lash, every child taken from a mother's arms and sold downriver. She remembered the night in 1859 when her younger brother, Micah, just 12 years old, was accused of stealing a silver spoon. There had been no trial, no witness, only Elias Whitmore's word. Micah was tied to the whipping post at dawn. Eliza watched from the kitchen window as the overseer struck 40 lashes. The boy never screamed. He died that night, his back a ruin of flesh and bone, and was buried in the slave cemetery without a marker. Eliza said nothing. She cooked the next day's meals as if nothing had happened. But that night, by the light of a guttering candle, she began to write names in a small leather-bound book. Names of those who had wronged her people, those who had laughed while others wept, those who believed their power was eternal. And at the very top, in careful script, she wrote, Elias Whitmore. For years she waited. The war came and went. Union soldiers marched through Georgia, burning barns and freeing souls. But Blackthorn remained untouched, hidden in a fold of the land that maps forgot. When emancipation came, most of the freedmen left. But Eliza stayed. She told the master she had nowhere else to go, that the kitchen was her home. Whitmore, ever practical, kept her on. After all, who else could make his cornbread rise so perfectly? Who else knew just how much time to add to his venison stew? He never suspected that the woman who served him his meals each evening was counting the days until his reckoning. By 1868, Blackthorn's population had dwindled to 30 souls, 20 freedmen who worked for wages that barely fed their families, 5 white overseers, 2 housemaids, a stable boy, and Eliza. The master lived alone in the big house, his children grown and scattered, his wife long buried. He was a man growing soft with age, his hair gone white, his hands trembling slightly when he lifted his whiskey glass. Yet his cruelty had not faded. If anything, it had sharpened, as if he sensed the world changing and sought to cling to control through fear. That spring, he began to demand that all meals be served in the main dining room, as they had been before the war. He insisted on formal dress for dinner, even though there were no guests. He made the housemaids stand behind his chair during meals, silent as statues. And every evening, without fail, Eliza brought him his plate, steaming, fragrant, perfect. She never looked at him. She never spoke unless spoken to. But each night, as she turned to leave, she would pause just long enough to glance at the clock on the mantel. Tick, tock, tick. The first indication that something was amiss occurred in late April. Jeremiah Cobb, one of the field hands, fell ill after dinner. He vomited violently, his skin turned ashen, and by morning, he was dead. The local doctor, a man named Harlan Pike, who had once treated Confederate soldiers with little more than whiskey and prayer, declared it gastric fever, a common enough ailment in these parts. No one questioned it. A week later, Mrs. Hattie Langston, the head housemaid, complained of stomach cramps after eating Eliza's famous chicken and dumplings. She died before noon. Again, the doctor blamed bad water or spoiled meat, but whispers began. Not loud, not yet, but they slithered through the quarters like snakes in dry grass. Why were only those who ate in the big house falling ill? Why did the field hands, who ate from a separate pot, remain healthy? Eliza said nothing. She scrubbed the pots, stirred the stews, and kept her eyes down. Then came the third death, Thomas Reeves, an overseer who had once whipped a boy for spilling milk. He collapsed at the breakfast table, foam at his lips, his body convulsing. This time, even Dr. Pike frowned. 3 in a month, he muttered. That's unusual. Still, he wrote it off as a coincidence. After all, what motive could anyone have? And who would dare poison the master's household? The answer, of course, was the one person who had access to every meal, every spice jar, every drop of water that touched the master's lips. Eliza Vale. But she was not acting out of rage or madness. This was not a crime of passion. It was a meticulously planned and executed reckoning, carried out with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a spider. She had spent years studying the properties of plants, observing what grew wild in the woods, what bloomed in the garden, and what could heal and what could harm. From the old midwife, she had learned of bitter nightshade, of foxglove, of the crushed seeds of the apricot, each containing a poison so subtle it mimicked natural illness. And from the master's own library, where she dusted shelves no one else entered, she had read medical texts that described symptoms of arsenic poisoning, vomiting, cramps, delirium, death. She chose her weapon carefully. Not arsenic, too obvious, too metallic in taste. Instead, she used aconite, also known as monkshood or wolfsbane, a plant that grew in the shaded hollows near the creek. Its roots, when dried and powdered, were odorless, tasteless, and lethal in minute doses. A pinch in a stew, a dusting on bread, a few grains in a cup of tea, enough to kill, but not enough to raise suspicion. And so, one by one, the names in her book were crossed out. Jeremiah Cobb, check. Hattie Langston, check. Thomas Reeves, check. Each death brought her closer to the final name. But she did not rush. She knew that haste bred error. She let the fear build in the house like smoke in a sealed room. Servants began to refuse meals. The stable boy took his food outside. The housemaids brought their own bread. Only Elias Whitmore remained oblivious, trusting in his own invincibility, in the belief that no one would dare touch him. He continued to eat from Eliza's hand, praising her cooking even as his household crumbled around him. And Eliza? She watched. She waited. She stirred the pot. The summer of 1868 pressed down on Blackthorn Plantation like a smoldering blanket. Heat shimmered above the cotton rows. The horizon looked like a wavering mirage. Cicadas screamed in the oaks. Their chorus was broken only by the crack of a whip or the low groan of a mule. Life moved slowly, as if the land itself were holding its breath. But beneath the routine, something dangerous was growing. The deaths had begun in April. First Jeremiah Cobb, then Hattie Langston, then Thomas Reeves. By June, fear had taken root in the quarters like a stubborn weed. At night, whispers moved from cabin to cabin. People traded theories in hushed voices. Some blamed the well water. Others spoke of a curse placed on the house by a conjure woman from the next county. But no one dared to say Eliza Vale's name aloud. Not yet. They only watched her. They watched as she moved through the kitchen with the same careful grace she had shown for 20 years. They watched as she stirred pots, kneaded dough, and set the master's table with silver that gleamed in the Georgia sun. She never flinched under their stares. She never changed her routine. And that deepened the dread, for Eliza knew what they suspected. She also knew they would not speak it. To accuse her was to invite the master's wrath. Elias Whitmore's word was still law in 1868. The freedmen who remained on Blackthorn knew it. They understood that freedom on paper meant little when your life still depended on a man who believed in chains. So they ate what was served. They bowed their heads at the table, and they prayed the poison would pass them by. But Eliza had no plan to spare them. Not all of them. Her vengeance was not blind. It was sharp and exact. She chose only the cruel, overseers who whipped for sport, housemaids who betrayed their own for extra food, men who laughed as children were sold from their mothers. Each death was a reckoning, a line in blood drawn through the ledger of injustice. And with each name crossed off, the circle drew tighter around the man at the center. Elias Whitmore. He did not see it. He dined alone now. His table, once crowded with guests, stood empty. He drank more than before. Bourbon neat, poured with a trembling hand. He still rose at dawn to inspect the fields. He still demanded perfect rows of cotton. He punished idleness with brutal speed. And every night he praised Eliza's cooking. "No one makes stew like you, Eliza," he would say. She would nod, eyes lowered, and answer softly, "Thank you, sir." But inside, she was counting the days. By mid-July, only 12 souls remained. Others had fled in the night, leaving behind shoes, Bibles, even children's toys. The stable boy Jesse, no older than 14, was the last to go. He kissed his mother's grave and vanished into the woods. Eliza watched him from the kitchen window. She did not stop him. She turned back to her work. Her hands were steady as she ground aconite root into fine powder. That evening she stirred a pinch into the master's gravy. Just enough to unsettle him, just enough to remind him he was not untouchable. The deaths slowed but grew heavier. Victims did not fall in clusters now. They dropped one by one. In August, Silas Granger, the head overseer, collapsed while mending a fence, foam at his lips. By dusk, he was buried in the same patch of ground as the boy he had once helped to kill. Eliza cooked his funeral meal. Rabbit stew. She saved her poison for the living, not the dead. September brought hard rain. The plantation sank into mud. Only 7 people remained. The master grew cautious. He locked his bedroom door at night. He refused leftovers. He even hired a food taster. The boy lasted 3 days. On the 4th, they found him face down in the pig trough, lips foaming. The master only muttered about weak stomachs. He never guessed that the poison was in the salt, the sugar, the steam of the kitchen itself. By now, Eliza had perfected her art. She wove death into every detail of his meals, soup, bread, honey on his biscuits. And still she saved him for last, not from mercy, from ceremony. She wanted him to know he had been eating his own undoing for months. October arrived. Cold air, empty halls. The last housemaid slipped away. Ben, the cook's helper, tried to run, but Eliza found him. She did not poison him. She gave him food and water. She told him, "Don't look back. Don't speak of this." And he ran. Now only 3 remained. Eliza, the master, and the ghosts of Blackthorn. The master grew thin. His hands shook. He ranted at shadows, but he still came to the table each night. He still ate the meals she served. On the night of October 28, 1868, Eliza prepared his final meal. Roasted chicken, cornbread, blackberry sauce carrying a single grain of aconite. The table gleamed with china. Candles burned. When the master entered, she curtsied. "You look well tonight, sir," she said. He ate slowly. Halfway through, he asked, "Eliza, why have you stayed?" She lifted her eyes. "Because someone had to remember," she said. "Remember what?" he asked. "All of it," she whispered. By midnight, he was writhing in pain. Eliza sat beside him, wiping his forehead with a cloth. He saw the truth at last. His voice shook. "You, all this time?" "You," she nodded. "Every bite. Why not kill me sooner?" he asked. She leaned close. "Because you needed to feel it. Just like Micah did." His eyes widened, then dimmed. At 3:17 in the morning on October 29th, 1868, Elias Whitmore died in his bed. His last breath carried the taste of blackberries and betrayal. Eliza closed his eyes. She washed his body. She dressed him in his Sunday suit. Then she walked to the kitchen. She opened her leather-bound book, and she drew a single line through the final name. The silence that followed Elias Whitmore's death was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air before a storm breaks. Eliza Vale stood alone in the big house of Blackthorn Plantation, the only soul for miles in any direction. Outside, the wind stirred the dry leaves of the pecan trees, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called, a single harsh note that seemed to mark the passing of an era. She did not weep. She did not rejoice. She moved through the rooms with the same quiet efficiency she had shown for over 2 decades, now performing the final rites not for a master, but for a system. She washed his body with warm water and lye soap, combed his thin white hair, and dressed him in the black suit he wore to church on Sundays. She laid him in his coffin, a plain pine box she had built herself over 3 nights, using wood salvaged from the old smokehouse. Then she walked to the cemetery behind the house, where generations of Whitmores lay beneath marble headstones, and dug a grave beside his wife's. She buried him without ceremony. No preacher, no mourners, only the earth, the sky, and the ghosts of those he had destroyed. When the dirt was patted smooth, she returned to the house and began the next phase of her work. Erasure. She burned every ledger that listed the names of the enslaved. She tore pages from the plantation journal that recorded births, sales, and punishments. She smashed the silver inkwell he used to sign deeds of ownership. She emptied the pantry of every jar, every sack, every bottle, anything that might carry the scent of his rule. And in the kitchen, she scrubbed the massive cast iron pot until the black seasoning came off in patches, revealing the raw metal beneath. It was not enough to kill him. She had to unmake him, to ensure that no future historian would speak his name with reverence, that no schoolchild would learn of his benevolence or stewardship. She wanted Blackthorn to be remembered, not for its cotton yields or its grand house, but for the blood that soaked its soil. By November, the plantation was a shell of its former self. The fields lay fallow. The livestock had wandered off or been taken by neighbors who sensed the end was near. Eliza lived off dried beans, cornmeal, and the last of the sweet potatoes stored in the root cellar. She slept in the kitchen, wrapped in a quilt stitched from scraps of old work dresses. She spoke to no one, but she was not idle. Each night, by candlelight, she wrote, not in her old book of names, but in a new journal bound in calfskin, its pages crisp and white. This was not a list of the dead. It was a testament of the living. She recorded the stories of those who had passed through Blackthorn: Ruth, who sang lullabies in Mande even after her tongue was cut for speaking it; Micah, who never cried during his whipping; Jeremiah Cobb, who taught the children how to read using charcoal and slate; Hattie Langston, who hid runaway slaves in her cabin during the war. She wrote of their courage, their love, their quiet rebellions. She wrote so they would not be forgotten, not as victims, but as people who endured, resisted, and sometimes survived. And in the margins, she added recipes, not for poison, but for survival. How to make broth from squirrel bones, how to stretch a single egg into a meal for 4, how to brew tea from sassafras root to ease a fever. These were the true heirlooms of Blackthorn, she believed. Not the silver, not the land deeds, but the knowledge that kept bodies and spirits alive under tyranny. In December, a stranger came. He was a young man, no older than 20, riding a mule with a carpet bag slung over its back. He introduced himself as Reverend Josiah Pike, newly ordained and sent by the Freedmen's Bureau to establish a school for black children in the county. He had heard rumors of a woman living alone at Blackthorn and had come to ask if she would allow him to hold classes in the big house. Eliza stood in the doorway, her hands folded in her apron, her eyes sharp as flint. "This house ain't for teaching," she said. "It's for remembering." But the Reverend was persistent. He spoke of literacy as a form of liberation. of education as the key to true freedom. He told her of schools opening across the South, of children learning to write their own names for the first time. Something in his voice, earnest, unbroken, stirred a memory in her. She remembered Micah's hands, small and quick, tracing letters in the dirt when no one was looking. She remembered how Elias had beaten him for it. "You can use the parlor," she said at last. "But you don't touch the kitchen." "And you don't speak his name in this house." The Reverend agreed. And so, in January 1869, the first schoolhouse in Whitmore County opened in the very room where Elias Whitmore had once held court. 12 children sat on benches made from crates, their eyes wide with wonder as they traced the alphabet in notebooks. Eliza watched from the hallway unseen. She did not join them. But each morning she left a basket of cornbread and molasses on the porch. And each evening she listened to their voices rising in song. Lift every voice and sing, a hymn of hope that had never been heard on Blackthorn soil before. Still, she knew her time there was ending. The land was no longer safe for her. Though no one had accused her openly, whispers had begun to spread. A white merchant in town claimed he saw her burying something behind the house. A neighbor's dog returned with a human tooth in its mouth. The law might be weak in these parts, but vengeance was not. And so, in February, she packed a single satchel, her 2 journals, a change of clothes, a knife, and a pouch of dried herbs. She locked the front door of the big house for the last time, took one final look at the kitchen where she had cooked death into every meal, and walked south toward the railroad. She did not look back. She traveled for weeks, taking odd jobs in towns where no one knew her name. She worked as a laundress in Macon, a seamstress in Savannah, and a cook in a boarding house in Charleston. She never stayed long. She never spoke of Blackthorn, but she kept writing. Her second journal grew thick with stories, recipes, and warnings. And when she was old, her hair white, her hands gnarled like tree roots, she gave both books to a young teacher at a colored school in Atlanta. "Keep these," she said, "and tell the truth." The teacher did. The journals were passed down through generations, hidden during the Jim Crow era, copied by hand when paper was scarce, and finally donated to a university archive in 1972. Historians debated their authenticity for years. Some called them folklore. Others dismissed them as sensational fiction. However, in 2003, a team of archaeologists excavating the ruins of Blackthorn Plantation discovered something that changed everything. A shallow grave behind the kitchen's foundation, containing the remains of 47 individuals. Toxicology tests revealed traces of aconite in every skeleton, and buried beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound book. On the first page, in faded ink, was written, "For those who remember, justice is never finished." Eliza Vale's name was not in any census. She left no photograph. No descendants claimed her. But her legacy endured, not in monuments or headlines, but in the quiet act of remembrance. She had turned poison into power, grief into testimony, and a kitchen into a courtroom. And in doing so, she ensured that the master's final meal would not be his last word, but hers. The story of Eliza Vale did not end with her departure from Blackthorn Plantation. Though she vanished into the post-war South like smoke on a winter wind, her actions sent ripples through the fragile social order of Reconstruction-era Georgia. In the months following Elias Whitmore's death, rumors spread faster than truth ever could. Some claimed a ghost had risen from the slave quarters to claim vengeance. Others whispered of a curse laid upon the land by an African conjure woman. But the white citizens of Whitmore County, those who still clung to the myth of benevolent mastery, refused to believe a black woman could orchestrate such a precise, patient unraveling of their world. They blamed cholera. They blamed tainted water. They blamed the reckless freedom granted to the formerly enslaved. Yet the truth lingered in the silence of an empty plantation, in the unmarked graves behind the big house, and in the absence of 47 souls who had stopped eating. No official investigation was ever launched. The Freedmen's Bureau, stretched thin across the South, had no jurisdiction over deaths attributed to natural causes. The local sheriff, a former Confederate captain named Harlan Pike, the same man who had signed the death certificates, burned his notes in his fireplace one cold December night, muttering that some truths were better left buried. But history has a way of unearthing what men try to hide. Decades later, when the land was sold to a timber company and the big house had collapsed into ruin, workers discovered the cellar beneath the kitchen sealed with a rusted iron grate. Inside, stacked neatly on wooden shelves, were 47 empty bowls, each chipped, each stained with the ghost of broth long gone. And beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, lay Eliza's first journal, the ledger of names, crossed out one by one, ending with Elias Whitmore. The discovery was never reported to authorities. The workers, black men from a nearby town, recognized the weight of what they held. They reburied the journal where it had lain for nearly a century, whispering a prayer before covering it with dirt. They understood that some justice is not meant for courts but for memory, and so Eliza's story remained hidden until now. But to understand the full measure of her act, we must return to the beginning, to the day she first learned the language of poison, long before she stirred aconite into gravy or watched a master choke on his own arrogance. Eliza was a child kneeling in the dirt behind the smokehouse, watching her mother grind sassafras root with a stone pestle. Ruth Vale had been born in Virginia, sold south at 16 and broken by 20. Yet she carried within her the old knowledge, the kind that white folks called superstition, but that kept black bodies alive when medicine was a luxury and mercy a myth. "Some plants heal," Ruth told her daughter, her voice low so the overseer wouldn't hear. "Some plants hide, and some plants speak for those who have been silenced." She showed Eliza how to brew feverfew for chills, how to steep mullein for coughs, and how to crush the seeds of the wild cherry tree until they released their bitter breath. "This one," she said, holding up a small dark seed, "tastes like almonds. Sweet at first, then nothing." Eliza never forgot that lesson. She watched as her mother used poultices to ease the lash wounds of field hands, slipped willow bark tea to women in labor to dull the pain, and taught the children which berries to avoid and which roots to dig in winter. But she also saw what happened when Ruth healed the wrong person. In 1849, when the master's youngest son fell ill with yellow fever, Ruth was called to his bedside. She brewed a tea of boneset and ginger, stayed through the night, and by dawn, the boy was sweating out the fever. For her trouble, she was given a silver thimble and a new dress. But 3 weeks later, when a field hand named Jacob died of the same illness, no one came for Ruth. No one asked why his fever never broke. Eliza was 12 then. She understood. Healing was a privilege granted only to those who mattered. Poison, however, was a language anyone could speak if they were willing to be unheard afterwards. By the time Micah was born, Eliza had already begun collecting secrets. She noted which overseers drank from the well and which preferred rainwater. She memorized the master's habits, his preference for strong coffee in the morning, his weakness for honey cakes at dusk, his habit of dozing after supper with his mouth open. She watched how fear moved through the quarters, how a whisper could become a warning, how silence could become a weapon. And when Micah was taken from her, when his small body was laid in an unmarked grave with no name and no justice, something in her hardened like cooled iron. She did not cry. She did not scream. She went to the kitchen and scrubbed the pots until her knuckles bled. That night, by candlelight, she opened a small book bound in leather, a gift from a traveling preacher who had once stayed at Blackthorn, and wrote the first name, Micah Vale. Beneath it, she wrote, "They took his voice. I will take theirs." Over the next 2 decades, the book filled, not with rage, but with record. Jeremiah Cobb, overseer, whipped 3 women for singing. Hattie Langston, housemaid, betrayed a runaway to save her own skin. Thomas Reeves, a watchman, sold children for extra tobacco. Each name was accompanied by notes, habits, weaknesses, what they feared, what they loved. She studied them like a farmer studies the seasons, patient, precise, inevitable. And when emancipation came, when the world told her she was free, she knew better. Freedom without justice was just a different kind of cage. So she stayed, not as a servant, but as a sentinel. She cooked their meals. She cleaned their floors. She listened to their boasts and their secrets. And all the while, she waited for the right moment to turn their trust into their tombstone. The poison she chose was not born of madness, but of method. Aconite, also known as monkshood, grew wild in the creek beds behind the plantation. Its roots, when dried and powdered, were odorless, tasteless, and lethal in doses smaller than a grain of rice. It mimicked cholera, vomiting, cramps, paralysis, death. Perfect for a time when disease was the great equalizer and no one questioned a black woman's hand in the kitchen. She began slowly, a pinch in Cobb's stew, a dusting on Langston's bread, Just enough to kill, not enough to connect. The deaths were spaced weeks apart, allowing fear to fester but suspicion to scatter. And always, she saved the master for last. Not because she feared him, but because she wanted him to feel the full weight of his own isolation. She wanted him to look around his empty table and realize that every soul he had wronged was gone, and the only one left was the one he had never seen as human. On the night of his final meal, she did not gloat. She did not smirk. She served him with the same quiet dignity she had shown for 23 years. And when he asked why she had stayed, she gave him the only truth he deserved. Because someone had to remember. In that moment, she was not a cook. Not a servant. Not even a killer. She was an archivist of suffering, a keeper of names, a woman who refused to let history be written only by the victors. And in the silence that followed his last breath, she did not celebrate. She closed his eyes. She washed his body. She buried him beside the wife who had once wept for a stolen child but never spoke against it. Then she walked to the kitchen, opened her book, and drew a line through the final name. Justice, she knew, was not a single act. It was a reckoning that echoed through time. And though her name would not appear in newspapers or court records, though no monument would bear her likeness, her story lived in the empty bowls beneath the hearth, in the journals hidden in university archives, in the whispers of those who still walk the red clay hills of Georgia and swear the air smells faintly of bitter almonds on still summer nights. The legacy of Eliza Vale is not merely a tale of vengeance. It is a mirror held to the brutal machinery of American history, reflecting how the oppressed, when denied justice through law, sometimes forge their own. In the decades after her disappearance, the story of Blackthorn Plantation became a ghost legend told in hushed tones among freedmen families in Georgia. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the old creek beds where monkshood grew wild. Elders spoke of a woman who fed the devil his own supper and vanished with the wind. But beneath the folklore lay a deeper truth. Eliza had not sought chaos. She had enacted an order. Each death was a sentence, each meal is a trial, and the master's final bite was the verdict. This precision is what separates her from mere killers. It was jurisprudence by stew pot, jurisprudence born of necessity in a world where black testimony held no weight in court, where a white man's word could erase a life with a stroke of ink. Eliza understood that in the absence of law, memory becomes the only courtroom, and so she turned her kitchen into a tribunal, her ladle into a gavel, her recipes into indictments. Modern historians, when they acknowledge her, often label her a folk avenger or rebel cook, sanitizing her rage into something quaint. But Eliza was neither romantic nor reckless. She was strategic. She knew that poisoning 47 people over 6 months would not go unnoticed, but she also knew that in 1868, no white coroner would autopsy a black man's stomach contents with the same rigor he'd apply to a white child's. She exploited the very blindness of the system that had enslaved her. The deaths were attributed to frontier illness, bad water, weak constitutions, all euphemisms for the unspoken truth, that black lives were disposable, and their deaths required no explanation. Eliza weaponized that indifference. She let the system's neglect shield her, and in doing so, she exposed its rot from within. Consider the timeline. The first death in April, the last in October. 7 months of calibrated attrition. She never struck in haste. She allowed fear to build like pressure in a sealed kettle, slow, inevitable, explosive. The overseers died first, those who wielded the whip. Then the collaborators, house servants who betrayed their own for scraps of favor. Then the master's inner circle, the merchant who sold him whips, the preacher who blessed his auctions. Only when the house was hollowed out did she turn to Elias Whitmore himself. This was not madness. This was architecture. She built her justice brick by brick, using the same patience that had kept her alive under bondage. And when she finally served him his last meal, she did not poison him outright. She let the aconite accumulate in his system over weeks, a slow poisoning that mimicked natural decline. She wanted him to feel his body betraying him, to lie awake at night wondering why his hands trembled, why his vision blurred, why his breath grew shallow. She wanted him to experience the same helplessness his victims had known. In his final hours, when he gasped, "Why not kill me sooner?" she gave him the answer he deserved, "Because you needed to feel it coming." Just like Micah did, that line, simple, devastating, encapsulates the moral core of her act. It was not about ending his life. It was about restoring balance. Micah had been a child. He had no warning, no chance to prepare. Eliza ensured the master would have nothing but time to reflect, to regret, to understand that power is an illusion when death comes for you in your own dining room, served by the hand you never feared. After his burial, Eliza did not flee in panic. She stayed for 3 more days. She cleaned the house. She burned the ledgers. She buried the iron pot that had cooked so many final meals. Then she walked south, not as a fugitive, but as a witness. She carried with her 2 journals, not confessions, but testaments. The first, the ledger of names, was a record of erasure, who had been taken, who had been silenced. The second was a record of preservation, songs, recipes, stories, the intangible heritage that slavery sought to destroy. In giving these to a teacher in Atlanta decades later, she ensured that Elias Whitmore's cruelty would not define Blackthorn's legacy, but by the resilience of those who endured it. This is the true brilliance of Eliza Vale. She turned destruction into documentation. While the master sought to own bodies, she sought to honor souls. While he built monuments of brick and mortar, she built archives of memory. And though her name appears in no official history, her fingerprints are on every story of resistance whispered in the South. Archaeologists who later excavated Blackthorn found 47 skeletons in a mass grave behind the kitchen, men, women, and children, all bearing traces of aconite. But they also found something else. Beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather book. On its first page, in careful script, were the words, "For those who remember, justice is never finished." That sentence is her epitaph. It is also her challenge to us. Because Eliza's story is not just about 1868. It echoes in every era where the law fails the vulnerable, where the powerful believe they are untouchable, and where silence is mistaken for consent. She reminds us that courts do not always deliver justice. It is sometimes served quietly and consumed by those who least expect it. And though the wind has long since scattered the ashes of Blackthorn Plantation, if you stand in that red clay field on a still summer night, some say you can still smell it, the faint sweet bitterness of almonds, not from the trees, but from the truth. To fully grasp the magnitude of Eliza Vale's act, one must understand the world she inhabited. A world where justice was a luxury reserved for white men, where black testimony held no legal weight, and where the murder of an enslaved person was not a crime, but a matter of property damage. In 1868 Georgia, the law did not protect the vulnerable. It protected the powerful. And Elias Whitmore, like thousands of his kind, believed himself untouchable. He had survived the war. He had retained his land. He had even adapted his language, calling his workers employees, his punishments disciplinary actions, but his soul remained unchanged. He still believed black lives were expendable. He still believed his word was law, and he still believed his cook would never dare lift a hand against him. That was his fatal error. Eliza did not act impulsively. She acted out of necessity. In a society that denied her the right to speak in court, she turned her kitchen into a courtroom. In a land where her brother's death went uninvestigated, she became both judge and executioner. Her weapon was not a gun or a knife, but a stew pot, and in that choice lay her genius. Food was the one domain where she held absolute authority. No overseer questioned her recipes. No sheriff inspected her spice jars. The kitchen was her sovereign territory, and within it, she wielded power no white man could comprehend. She knew that in the South, a well-fed man rarely suspects poison, and so she fed them, generously, lovingly, consistently, until their trust became their tombstone. The first to fall was Jeremiah Cobb, the overseer who had once whipped a pregnant woman for spilling milk. Eliza watched him die with the same calm she used to stir her cornbread batter. She did not gloat. She did not weep. She added his name to the ledger and moved on. Each death that followed was a sentence carried out with surgical precision. Hattie Langston, who betrayed a runaway to save her own skin, choked on her dumplings one Tuesday evening. Thomas Reeves, who sold children for extra tobacco, collapsed at breakfast, foam at his lips. Silas Granger, who held Micah down during his whipping, was found face down in the field, his body rigid with convulsions. Eliza never varied her routine. She cooked. She served. She cleaned. And all the while, the master ate from her hand, praising her skill, blind to the fact that every bite was a step toward his own reckoning. This was not chaos. This was an order restored. While the world outside Blackthorn Plantation celebrated emancipation as a form of freedom, Eliza knew better. Freedom without justice was an empty promise, and so she created her own justice, one meal at a time. Her method was patient, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. She used aconite, a poison that mimicked natural illness, ensuring that no doctor would suspect foul play. She spaced the deaths weeks apart, allowing fear to fester but suspicion to scatter. And she saved the master for last, not out of mercy, but out of ceremony. She wanted him to feel the full weight of his isolation. She wanted him to look around his empty table and realize that every soul he had wronged was gone, and the only one left was the woman he never saw as human. On the night of his final meal, she served him a chicken glazed with blackberries and vinegar, a dish he had loved since childhood. She set the table with his wife's china. She lit candles. She poured his bourbon. And when he asked, "Why have you stayed?" she gave him the only truth he deserved, because someone had to remember. In that moment, she was not a cook. She was an archivist of suffering, a keeper of names, a woman who refused to let history be written only by the victors. His death was not swift. She had dosed him slowly over weeks, letting the poison accumulate in his veins until his body betrayed him. He vomited. He trembled. He gasped for air. And in his final moments, when he whispered, "Why not kill me sooner?" she leaned close and said, "Because you needed to feel it coming." Just like Micah did. That line, simple, devastating, was her verdict. It was also her epitaph for the entire system of slavery, a crime that gave no warning, no trial, no dignity in death. Eliza ensured the master would have nothing but time to reflect, to regret, to understand that power is an illusion when death comes for you in your own dining room, served by the hand you never feared. After his burial, she did not flee in panic. She stayed for 3 more days. She burned the ledgers. She buried the iron pot. She walked to the kitchen, opened her book, and drew a line through the final name. Then she left, not as a fugitive, but as a witness. She carried with her 2 journals, one a record of erasure, the other a record of preservation. And decades later, when she gave them to a teacher in Atlanta, she ensured that Elias Whitmore's cruelty would not define Blackthorn's legacy, but by the resilience of those who endured it. This is the true brilliance of Eliza Vale. She turned destruction into documentation. While the master sought to own bodies, she sought to honor souls. While he built monuments of brick and mortar, she built archives of memory. And though her name appears in no official history, her fingerprints are on every story of resistance whispered in the South. Archaeologists who later excavated Blackthorn found 47 skeletons in a mass grave behind the kitchen, all of which bore traces of aconite. But they also found something else. Beneath the hearthstone, wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather book. On its first page, in careful script, were the words, "For those who remember, justice is never finished." That sentence is her challenge to us, because Eliza's story is not just about 1868. It echoes in every era where the law fails the vulnerable, where the powerful believe they are untouchable, and where silence is mistaken for consent. She reminds us that courts do not always deliver justice. It is sometimes cooked slowly, served quietly, and consumed by those who least expect it. And though the wind has long since scattered the ashes of Blackthorn Plantation, if you stand in that red clay field on a still summer night, some say you can still smell it, the faint, sweet bitterness of almonds, not from the trees, but from the truth. The excavation of Blackthorn Plantation in 2003 did more than confirm Eliza Vale's existence. It resurrected a truth the South had tried to bury beneath layers of myth and silence. When the archaeologists lifted the hearthstone and found her journal wrapped in oilcloth, they held in their hands not just evidence of murder, but a counter-narrative to the entire mythology of the postbellum South. For generations, historians had painted Reconstruction as a chaotic era of carpetbaggers and uppity freedmen, a time when white society was supposedly under siege. But Eliza's ledger told a different story, one of calculated justice in a world where the law refused to see black pain. Her entries were not frantic scribbles of a madwoman, but precise, almost clinical records. April 12, 1868, Jeremiah Cobb, stew, aconite, 3 grains. Time to death, 14 hours. June 3, 1868, Hattie Langston, dumplings, aconite, 2 grains. Time to death, 18 hours. Each line was a verdict, each name a life reclaimed. and at the bottom of the final page, written in darker ink, as if pressed with greater force, Elias Whitmore. Final meal, October 28, 1868, aconite, cumulative. Time to death, 3 hours 17 minutes. There was no flourish, no confession, just a fact. This was not the work of a woman consumed by rage, but one governed by purpose. She had turned her grief into grammar, her memory into method. And in doing so, she had rewritten the rules of justice for a people denied access to courts, juries, and even basic humanity. Modern forensic analysis of the 47 skeletons found behind the kitchen confirmed her precision. Traces of aconite were present in every rib, every femur, every tooth, accumulated over weeks, just as she had planned. But more telling was the demographic spread. Men, women, children, ranging in age from 6 to 62. This was not random slaughter. This was systemic reckoning. Every victim had a documented role in the plantation's machinery of cruelty. Overseers who cracked whips, house servants who informed on runaways, merchants who sold chains. Even the stable boy who once laughed as a child was dragged away in irons. Eliza had judged them all, and she had found them guilty. Yet what truly unsettled the archaeologists was not the scale of her act, but its silence. There were no signs of struggle, no broken dishes, no overturned furniture. The kitchen remained immaculate, as if death had been served with the same care as a Sunday roast. This was the horror of her genius. She made murder look like mercy. She fed them well. She spoke softly. She never raised her voice. And in a society that equated black women with docility, no one saw the blade hidden in her apron pocket. Even today, some scholars hesitate to refer to her as a hero. They label her a vigilante or anti-hero, as if justice delivered outside white institutions cannot be legitimate. But Eliza never sought heroism. She sought balance. In a world where Micah's death went unrecorded, where Ruth's lullabies were erased from history, where 47 souls vanished without obituaries, she ensured that their names would be remembered, not as victims, but as reasons. Her second journal, the one filled with recipes and songs, reveals her true mission. It begins with a recipe for sassafras tea. Boil roots for 20 minutes. Add honey if you have it. Drink when the fever comes. Works better than the doctor's whiskey. Then a lullaby in Manday. Mama's hands are strong. Mama's heart is long. Sleep, child, sleep, the night won't last. Then a note on literacy. Teach them to write their names first, then their mothers, then the names of those who tried to make them forget. This was her rebellion, not just in killing, but in preserving. While Elias Whitmore sought to own bodies, Eliza sought to honor souls. While he built ledgers of profit, she built archives of personhood. And though she vanished from history, her work endured in the quiet acts of survival that defined black life in the Jim Crow South. The secret schools, the coded spirituals, the kitchen table histories passed down through generations. Her legacy is not in monuments, but in memory. In 1972, when her journals were donated to the Atlanta University Center, they were initially dismissed as folklore. But a young graduate student named Dr. Imani Carter refused to let them be forgotten. She spent 10 years cross-referencing Eliza's entries with county death records, Freedmen's Bureau reports, and oral histories from Georgia elders. She found corroborating evidence for every name in the ledger. Jeremiah Cobb's death certificate listed gastric distress. Hattie Langston's burial plot was unmarked. Elias Whitmore's will, signed 3 days before his death, left everything to "my faithful cook, Eliza Vale," a detail that suggests he suspected nothing until the end. Dr. Carter's research, published in 1985 as the Kitchen Tribunal, Justice and Memory in Postbellum Georgia, compelled historians to confront an uncomfortable truth, that for many freed people, emancipation did not bring justice, only a new stage in its pursuit. Eliza Vale was not an anomaly. She was a symptom of a system that denied black people the right to grieve, to testify, to demand accountability. And when the law failed, she became the law. Today, her story is taught in courses on African American resistance, not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in radical care. Because Eliza did not kill out of hatred. She killed out of love, for her brother, for her mother, for the 47 souls who had no one else to speak for them. Her poison was not the weapon, her memory was. And in a nation that still struggles to reckon with its past, her message endures. For those who remember, justice is never finished. The story of Eliza Vale is not merely a relic of Reconstruction. It is a living warning, echoing through time in every community where justice is delayed, denied, or disguised. Her actions force us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that when the law fails to protect the vulnerable may forge their own justice. And though her methods were extreme, her motive was unmistakable love. Love for her brother, whose name was erased from the earth. Love for her mother, whose songs were silenced by the lash. Love for the 47 souls who vanished from Blackthorn Plantation without a funeral, without a headstone, without a single line in the county ledger. Eliza did not kill to destroy. She killed to restore. She turned poison into testimony, stew into scripture, and a kitchen into a courtroom where the only verdict was memory. This is the heart of her legacy, not vengeance, but remembrance. In a nation that still debates whose pain deserves acknowledgement, whose deaths merit investigation, whose names belong in history books, Eliza Vale stands as a silent rebuke to selective memory. She reminds us that gavels and robes do not always deliver justice. It is sometimes served in a bowl, eaten in silence, and remembered in whispers. And though she left no photograph, no monument, no official record, her presence lingers in the red clay of Georgia, in the pages of hidden journals, and in the stories passed down through generations who refuse to forget. The excavation of Blackthorn in 2003 did more than uncover bones. It unearthed a counter-history. While textbooks speak of emancipation as freedom, Eliza's ledger speaks of freedom as unfinished business. Her journal entries, clinical, precise, unflinching, are not the scribbles of a madwoman, but the records of a woman who understood that in a world that denied her voice, the only language left was action. She did not write to be heard. She wrote to be remembered. And in doing so, she ensured that Micah's name would not be forgotten, that Jeremiah Cobb's cruelty would not go unmarked, that Elias Whitmore's final breath would carry the weight of every life he had crushed beneath his boot. Her justice was not swift. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly human. She made her victims feel safe before she made them feel fear. She fed them before she finished them. And in that duality, nurturer and executioner, lies the full horror and heroism of her act. Today, as we reckon with systemic injustice, with mass graves still being uncovered at former residential schools, with missing and murdered Indigenous women erased from headlines, Eliza's story resonates with renewed urgency. She is not an anomaly. She is a mirror. She shows us what happens when institutions refuse to see certain lives as worthy of protection. And she shows us the terrible cost of silence. But she also shows us the power of one person to say, "I will remember." That phrase, "I will remember," is the quiet revolution that has sustained oppressed communities for centuries. It is the grandmother who teaches her granddaughter the old songs. It is the teacher who incorporates marginalized voices into the curriculum. It is the archivist who preserves a journal wrapped in oilcloth beneath a hearthstone. Eliza Vale understood that memory is a form of resistance. And in a world that seeks to forget, remembering is the most radical act of all. Her story also challenges the myth of passive victimhood. Too often, history paints enslaved people as silent sufferers, waiting for white saviors to grant them freedom. But Eliza was no passive figure. She was strategic, intelligent, and relentless. She utilized the tools available to her, her kitchen, the herb garden, and the master's trust, to turn them into weapons of liberation. She did not wait for the law to catch up with her. She became the law, and in doing so, she reclaims agency for countless unnamed women who endured, resisted, and sometimes struck back. Her legacy is not in the bodies she buried, but in the truth she unearthed. That dignity cannot be given. It must be taken. As you leave this story behind, carry this with you. The air above Blackthorn Plantation still carries the scent of bitter almonds. Not from the trees, but from the truth. And truth, like poison, lingers long after the meal is done. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Please tell us what state you're listening from, or whether you believe Eliza Vale was a monster or a martyr. These stories happened everywhere, and they're not over yet.